So my last talk was about prevalence as a measure of disease frequency or disease occurrence, and I ended that talk outlining the limitations of prevalence, which is really why we need incidence when we can measure it, because it's a much more informative measure. So incidence can be defined as the number of new cases of disease that develop in a population at risk during a specified time period. And it has three components, as you can see here. So new disease events, so that's really the defining feature. And then there's a time period, a follow-up period, during which these new events, new disease cases are recorded. And then we have a population at risk, also known sometimes as a candidate population. And the population at risk is defined in terms of people who do not have the disease at the beginning of the follow-up period, but they should be at risk of getting it during that follow-up period, or at risk as we sometimes say. So let's talk briefly about the population at risk. So any person who's in the denominator population, in other words the base population, should have the potential to be counted in the numerator if they get the disease, or they should at least have the potential to get the disease. In other words, they should be at risk for the condition. So there's a couple of examples there. Obviously, if you're calculating an incidence rate for prostate cancer, you wouldn't want to include women, and if you were calculating an incidence rate for cancer of the uterus, you wouldn't want to include women who've had a hysterectomy because they've had their uterus removed, and of course you wouldn't want to include males either. So like prevalence, there's more than one type of incidence measure, and we're going to discuss these two separately and how they're related to each other. So first of all, we have cumulative incidence, which goes under other names, including incidence, proportion, risk. Usually if people talk about risk, they're usually talking about cumulative incidence. And attack rate. Attack rate's mainly used in talking about acute disease outbreak situations. And then we have the other measure of incidence is incidence rate, and that also goes under other names. Quite commonly, it's referred to as incidence density, and in certain specific circumstances, it's referred to as the hazard rate. And I won't go into that in any more detail, except to say that if you do go on in epidemiology, you are more likely to encounter the hazard rate. And in some of the older literature, it may be referred to as the force of morbidity, or, if we're talking about death, force of mortality. So we're going to start by talking about cumulative incidence and what it is. So it can be defined as the number of new cases of a disease in the at-risk population, divided by the number of people in the at-risk population. So really it's a simple fraction, and it's measured over the course of a specified time period. And you have to specify the time period because the cumulative incidence will vary by the time period. And it's different from period prevalence because specifically period prevalence also contains existing cases. So, in other words, they began before the period of follow-up began, the time period that you're interested in. And also, the other thing about period prevalence, usually the information to calculate it is usually collected from people who are survivors at or after the end of the time period that's elapsed. In other words, so cumulative incidence measures sort of new cases, so somehow it's monitoring the population as cases occur, but period prevalence is usually involves data collected at the end of that period, and then just sort of looking back, and it includes those existing cases. So that's the distinction, although until you become familiar with these, it's easy to confuse the two. So you can think of cumulative incidence as estimating the probability that a person will develop disease. And again, in common parlance, we would say, what is the person's risk of getting a disease? So, and really, that's exactly what cumulative incidence is getting at. So, cumulative incidence is most useful for closed populations because usually the assumption is that we've followed everybody for the entire time period, and then we've got a proportion of the people who were there at the beginning and who developed the disease, newly developed the disease during that time period. So it makes sense then, if you think about it, that the cumulative incidence will increase with time, generally speaking, and so you've absolutely got to specify the time period. And this is illustrated by these two hypothetical measures of cumulative incidence and how it changes over time in two populations. So you can see that on the vertical axis, risk, or cumulative incidence, sort of goes up to 1 or 100%, and this is time in years. So if you can imagine a population exposed to a strong carcinogen or cancer-causing substance, then as time goes on, the number of people in that population who get the cancer will increase. However, if you have a population that's been vaccinated, then at around about say this time period, or somewhere around here, then in particular if it's an effective vaccine, then the cumulative incidence will basically level off. It may not, with many vaccines it wouldn't level off quite like this because many vaccines are not 100% protective, but it certainly would tend to sort of curve over and be the slope would diminish. So it just depends on the situation that you are looking with. But cumulative incidence is not going to decrease over time. It will, if anything, increase, but potentially in some instances it might, such as this vaccine example, it might level off. So, just by way of a simple example, looking at sudden infant death syndrome, we have a population of 1,000 live births and we follow them for 1 year, and during that time there are 10 cases of SIDS. The cumulative incidence will just be 1%. It's very straightforward and simple. The second example, just the intention of this example is to illustrate how we compare cumulative incidences. We try and we compare them by standardizing them at a kind of on a common basis. So usually we do this, we scale it up per 100,000 people per year, and so we have two cities, City A, City B. We follow City A, which is 25,000 people for 1 year. It has a cumulative incidence of 58 of the people get AIDS during that year, and so we can standardize that to a per 100,000 basis, and so it's 232. And similarly, we follow a smaller city B with 7,000 people for 2 years, and 35 people get AIDS during that time, and we just basically scale it up. We to per 100,000 years. So it's 250 per 100,000 per 1 year. So so on that basis we can compare the two populations, and on that basis it would seem that the cumulative incidence in the two populations is really not that different, one from the other. Perhaps City B has a slightly higher rate. Something we have to take into account is competing risks. So the basic underlying assumption for cumulative incidence is that everybody has followed over a long period of time, and that the only health outcome that anybody gets, the only thing that they die from, is the disease that we're interested in, that we're following. But particularly if you're following a population over a longer period, then people are going to die from other causes, and so we really have to take this into account when we're calculating our incidence rates. And otherwise, as I'll show you, we'll underestimate the true cumulative incidence. And the other problem that we run into with our cumulative incidence calculations is loss to follow-up. So this is a situation where we're following a population over time, but people, if you like, vanish off our radar screen. They may out-migrate, or otherwise just they basically disappear. Maybe they just don't return our phone calls, and they may still be in the area, but we're unable to follow them any longer. And so we talk about these people as lost to follow-up. And again, if we don't take these people into account, we'll also underestimate the true cumulative incidence in our population. So why does this underestimation occur? So it's fairly straightforward and intuitive if you think about it. So if we don't take into account these people who die from competing risks, or they're lost to follow-up, then we'll continue to treat them as alive. So our denominator will continue to contain those people. So basically, you could say that our denominator is an overestimate, but some of those people who either died from competing risks or were lost to follow-up, if they had remained in the cohort that hadn't died or been lost, then they would have presumably got the disease of interest. So we can then think that, but they're not counted because we don't receive any information that they had got the disease. So you can think of the numerator then being an underestimate. So if you then think of the impact on the proportion, numerator underestimated and the denominator overestimated, then the overall effect is to make the cumulative incidence lower than it would be if you could actually get a kind of a true measurement without these problems occurring. So also with cumulative incidence calculation, we often the nature of the calculation is such that we assume that we followed the population for the entire follow-up period, but we can't do that for reasons of people being lost to follow-up, and of course in any ordinary population people are coming and going, and some are dying of competing risks and so on. So this makes the cumulative incidence calculation somewhat problematic. So this is why, if we can, we often like to use another measure, which is incidence rate, which I mentioned before. So incidence rate overcomes these problems which are in cumulative incidence, and avoids the assumption that we usually make with our cumulative incidence calculations, that we have followed the entire group, the entire study population for the entire follow-up period. So incidence rate, simply defined, is the number of new cases of disease divided by person time at risk in the population. So I have to now define what I mean by person time at risk in the population. But just before I do that, just to say that, and I mentioned before that a rate is something that includes, takes into account time in the denominator, and incidence rate, also known as incidence density, takes into account time, integrates time into the denominator. So here's a simple explanation of person time. So we have a population here, which I might also refer to as a cohort, which will become clearer when I talk about cohort studies. But anyway, so we have these 5 persons that we follow in time. But one of them, and we follow them for 20 years, but one of them joins us after 10 years as it comes into the population being studied. So it's basically it's an open population, and each person contributes a different amount of time. So X here represents the outcome that we're interested in. It could be something like asthma, or it could be cancer, or whatever it may be, or diabetes, say, whatever it is that we happen to be interested in. So you can see that this person got that condition, X, after 10 years, and this person newly entered also got it after 10 years, but right at the end of the follow-up period. We refer to these 20 years as the follow-up period. So that was persons 1 and 2, they both got X. And person 3 came in, but after 10 years they died. And then person 4, after 15 years, they were lost to follow-up. And then, but person 5, they went on for the full 20 years of follow-up, and nothing happened. And they were not lost, didn't die, and they didn't get the disease X. So we take this information, we have 2 cases of the disease, 2 X's, and we can count the person years which each person has accrued. So that person accumulated 10 years, this one 10, 10 again, 15 and 20. We add these together, we have the total number of person years in the cohort, or in the population. Our incidence rate is simply the number of cases of X, 2, divided by total person years. Now, just to say, why do we stop counting the person years after this person got X? It's because they are no longer at risk. They can no longer be considered to be at risk. They got X, they're no longer at risk of getting it. So we don't count those additional 10 years. This person here, of course, they're dead. They no longer have any opportunity to get X, and nor is this person. Now, if they did get X, we wouldn't know about it. So we shouldn't be counting those lost 5 person years. So that's why we only count person years at risk. So let's illustrate that with an example. And this is actually an example of a study that I carried out when I lived in New Zealand. And so we were interested in cancer in firefighters, and we were able to obtain a database of all male firefighters in New Zealand, and we were able to follow them for up to 20 years. And so those 4,221 male firefighters contributed 62,000 person years at risk. So each of those firefighters was followed for an average of 14.8 years, and during that time 118 new cases of cancer of all types were diagnosed. And so the calculation of incidence rate is very straightforward, so that it's 118 divided by the 62,000 person years, which actually comes to a fraction. It's by 0.00189 per year, which is a very inconvenient number. So typically when we're expressing incidence rates, we express them in terms of per 100,000 person years. So this is done so we can get rid of these confusing decimal points. If we have decimal points, people get the decimal point wrong. So it becomes much easier if you can express it as an integer, and usually a base size of 100,000 person years is convenient for that. So we're not left with just a decimal point. So let's talk briefly about about interpretation of incidence, and now we know that both cumulative incidence and incidence rate. Now, cumulative incidence is much more readily explainable to people because it's a proportion, and already people are familiar with the idea of risk, intuitively familiar with risk. You know, people's risk being 10% or 5% or whatever, and basically that's how we express cumulative incidence. It's not so easy with incidence rate to express this in a way that people will understand, because incidence rate can range from 0 theoretically up to infinity, although it doesn't usually get to be that big. But anyway, it's theoretically possible, and it can also be expressed in various ways depending on the person time unit used. So we would usually, particularly with something like cancer, it would be convenient to express it per 100,000 person years, but you could express it, and it means exactly the same thing. 1.2 cases per 10,000 person years would be the same as 12 cases per 100,000 person years, and so on. We could express it in reference to any time frame that we like, but often these are not so convenient. These smaller time frames not so convenient. But 12 cases per 100,000 person years is relatively easy to remember. But this does not mean very much to most people. Most people are not familiar with the concept of person time, and so talking about the risk being 12 cases per 100,000 person years doesn't mean anything to people, and that's why usually when we're expressing things for broader consumption, we would use a measure of cumulative incidence, because that's intuitively relatively easily understood. There are instances when we may like to use denominators other than person time or follow-up. So, and these are some examples here. Infections per 1,000 surgeries, deaths per 1 million passenger miles, injuries per 100,000 licensed driver years. So, even though time is not so explicit in these denominators, it actually is occurring, because 1,000 surgeries takes time to perform. Passenger miles require time to occur, and so on. So these are less intuitively incidence rates, but they are actually incidence rates. Now, another thing about expressing things in terms of person years, which is confusing for people, is that you can accrue a set number of person years in many, many different ways. So just taking the example of 100 person years, for example, so that is equivalent to either 100 people followed for 1 year each, or 10 people followed for 10 years each, and so on. So if you just express them just as just basic person years, these are all effectively equivalent. In practice, however, when we actually carry out our epidemiologic analysis, we don't necessarily treat every person year as being equal. It depends on what age people are at and what calendar time period we're referring to. People's risk for disease varies from one age to another, and also risk factors in the population vary over calendar years, over calendar time. And we showed that example before with cigarettes. The prevalence of cigarette smoking changed over time. So correspondingly, the incidence rate of lung cancer changed over time. So we have to take these things into account, along with other things, including, for example, people's sex over time. So it's slightly simplistic just to express things relative to the number of person years. As we'll show you, you have to adjust for some of these other factors. And by way of example, this just illustrates how the importance of age, sex, and ethnic group. So you can see this is age-specific cancer rates for all cancer sites. For on the left, males, and on the right, women, females. And you can see that the cancer rate for males goes up far more dramatically than it does for females. And there is a difference between white males and black males. And also for black females and white females, although the divergence sort of is not till a slightly older age. And this, no doubt, these things are almost certainly reflecting, to some degree, differences in the prevalence of risk factors in these different populations. But it shows that the importance of age, the importance of sex, male or female, and the importance of racial group. Now there are a number of types of incidence rates which we'll be referring to, and so far I've only talked about what we might refer to as crude or unadjusted incidence rates or unstandardized incidence rates. And these are incidence rates which don't take into account any of these other factors, such as a calendar period or age of people or male or female or racial group. They're the raw rates, and they're really of fairly limited utility. The next level which we can look at are stratum-specific incidence rates. So we might, for example, just going back to the previous slide, we might just look at the rates for, say, white males, age 60 to 70, and just look at, for rates for, say, cancers for that group. And then it's less confused by differences, it's not confused by differences in sex or racial group. So we can stratify these populations and calculate incidence rates for each of those subpopulations defined in terms of, say, age and sex and racial group. But the problem is that when we do that, we end up with a huge number of different rates. So to get around that problem, we don't want to have to deal with many different rates. To get around that problem, we have methods to standardize or adjust rates so that we can compare across different populations. So we'll be talking about how to go about standardizing rates in a future lecture, not too far away, when we talk about comparing measures of disease frequency between populations. We'll be discussing the direct method of standardization. So, when do we use cumulative incidence and when do we use incidence rate? And that depends really on what we, the circumstances that we are in and what we want to know. So cumulative incidence, if we want to know a probability that somebody will develop a particular disease or die, then cumulative incidence is a very good measure. Or and really very much the same thing in many ways. If we want to know the proportion of a population that will get a particular disease during a specified time period, then cumulative incidence is the measure that we are interested in. A third situation occurs with acute disease outbreaks, where the sudden there's a sudden increase in cases of a particular disease, in which situation the time frame is much less important, and we may really be happy enough to get the counts of the number of disease cases, so within the at-risk population. So in that sort of situation, we'd also use incidence rate, cumulative incidence or risk. Incidence rate is particularly useful for people who are looking to see the changes in the occurrence of disease in a population, particularly how fast new cases are occurring, and whether or not there's a sort of upward trend or a downward trend. And this can be very useful for identifying outbreaks, disease outbreaks. Surveillance systems are constantly looking at changes in disease incidence, and they may pick up a sudden outbreak. They're useful for incidence rate is useful for judging the effectiveness of interventions, because you really want to know whether the rates are decreasing or not in response to the intervention, and incidence rate is ideal in that situation. And also many epidemiologists like incidence rate because they turn out to be useful in etiologic investigations. So etiologic investigations are studies which are attempting to identify risk factors or causes for disease. And finally, incidence rate is very useful when we're investigating disease occurrence in large populations, dynamic populations from which people are coming and going. And when measures of cumulative incidence are very difficult to get because they're just too dynamic. So people can come and go from a dynamic population and contribute a certain amount of person time, and if you're able to capture that person time, then you can get them, and also the frequency of disease occurrence, then you can get measures of incidence rate. But as I think already mentioned, incidence rate as such has no useful interpretation at the individual person level. You can't tell a person that their incidence rate is such and such and really have it mean anything to them. That's why we need to use cumulative incidence as well. So there is a certain relationship between cumulative incidence and incidence rate, but this only really works under special circumstances, and the two main criteria is that the incidence rate really needs to be low and the time period short, in which case cumulative incidence is approximately equal to the incidence rate times time. If the incidence rate is high, or particularly if the time period is long, you're going to need to use more complicated methods, life table methods. So here's an example, and just to illustrate the difficulty when the time frame is longer. So cumulative incidence equals incidence rate times time. So and the x-axis here is time. So basically this is a equation of a line, cumulative incidence on the vertical axis times time. So it's y equals incidence rate times x, really, if you want to think of it in terms of a regression equation. And so because incidence rate is fixed, it's a constant, that's of course the equation of a straight line. But in practice it doesn't quite work out like that. The actual cumulative incidence drops off like this, sort of curves downward. So you can see that it's only in this relatively short time period that the cumulative incidence equals the incidence rate times time. So the reason why there's this departure of the two lines from each other is that the population, the base population, is being slowly diminished or eroded at the rate of the incidence rate, so that the basic population is decreasing, and so the incidence rate is working on this diminishing denominator population. But this straight line here just assumes that there is no loss from mortality, which really doesn't make any sense. So the next slide, this slide, basically shows what happens. Here we have the base population starting at 1,000 people, and at the rate of 11 deaths per year, this population is diminishing. So the expected number of deaths based on the incidence rate is applied to the diminishing population, and so the cumulative deaths is less than would be predicted by the straight line equation. So that's why cumulative incidence and incidence rate have that simple relationship only over a short time period. If you do have a situation with a longer follow-up period, following people over a longer, say, age period, then there's a variant of that equation which you can use, which involves, to calculate the cumulative incidence, which involves summing, say, age-specific incidence rates over different age periods or time periods. So, and here we've divided our incidence rates by age strata, and now, so that's probably best illustrated with this example. So this example looks at cumulative incidence of breast cancer in California women over 30 years of life, from age 30 to age 59, based on average incidence rates over this calendar period, 98 to 2002. So what we're interested in, what is the cumulative incidence from age 30 to 59? So we have, as with most cancers, the incidence rate increases the older people get. So we have these 5-year age groups here, but within those 5-year age groups, the incidence rate differs and it increases steadily as women get older. So we need to take into account that information. But each of these is just a 5-year period. So what we do is we take this incidence rate for the 30 to 34-year-old group, which is 5 years, and we multiply the incidence rate times the time period 5. So that's actually 0.00002. 2 per 100,000 years. We multiply it by 5, we get 0.00010. And then we do that again for the 35 to 39-year-old age group. Again, we have a 5-year period, but a higher incidence rate. We multiply the two together, as we did for the earlier age group, and we get 0.00045. But at this point, it's appropriate to add the two together to get the cumulative incidence to date over this 30 to 39-year period. So we add this to this, and we get 0.00055. And so we basically continue that procedure across each of these age bands, these age strata, as we might call them, and we just keep adding them to get the cumulative incidence. And so age 50 to 59, we add that in, and so then we have a figure here, 0.01080, which is about 1%. So in other words, according to this calculation, California women between ages 30 and 59 have an approximately 1% chance of getting breast cancer during that time. And I mean, there's an inbuilt assumption here because we're only applying 98 to 2002 incidence rates, and of course a woman obviously will go through a broader calendar period as she ages from 30 to 59, but basically because we have available for this calculation these incidence rate data, we use them. If you have incidence rate data over a broader time period, you might be able to use that as well. So this method is only accurate if there's no significant mortality from competing risks. So if people were dying in significant numbers from competing risks, then the equation, the cumulative incidence, is equals the sum of the incidence rate times the time periods, would not be accurate. And for that reason, I've only carried out this calculation from ages 30 to 59. From age 60 onwards, competing risks, mortality from other causes becomes substantial, and the equation would become increasingly inaccurate. So if we do want to go on and carry out a more extended estimate of cumulative incidence, and we have to take into account life table methods. So I'm not going to go into life table methods very much in this class, but if you do go on epidemiology, you'll probably study them in some detail. And basically, life tables, very briefly, the tables of data on survivorship in populations over a long period of time, and they are used extensively by actuaries who work for life insurance companies who calculate the probability of people dying, and From that they can work out appropriate life insurance premiums. And the thing about life tables is that they can take into account both loss to follow-up and competing risks. So they're usually based on certain assumptions that apply at the time, because we don't exactly know what future risks will be, but so they make some assumptions based on current levels of risk or changing rates of mortality and morbidity.